Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, and also stop my video. Great, so the things I was going to show everyone just really briefly today, so kind of a taster, if you will, is, and it's because Ian was asking about what Joel used last night when it came to his luminosity mask and what have you, and he has his own panel. So let me find what I was going to go through. He has his own panel, which if you're going to do his stuff is actually really good, but it's very, very time consuming. And when I first started out and started doing processing, actually I did most things in Lightroom, and I'd only ever go into Photoshop when I did start doing that, if I needed to clone something out, so for some fine tuning. What I tended to use more often than not was actually the Google effects. Both the silver effects for me I really like, so I like mono, but also color effects. And I probably used that as my main editing over and above Lightroom for a good couple of years. And it was only when I started going on workshops and working with some real pros that would teach me how to use Photoshop a little bit more. So now I've progressed where I use Photoshop over and above Lightroom, and I do lots of luminosity masking, and I use something called TKActions, which is a fairly inexpensive way to get luminosity masking and a whole host of things that are so valuable I wouldn't want to let it go now. I still use some of the NikEfex stuff, but it tends to be less than I used to. So what I was going to propose I do tonight is take the photo, for example, that just did quite well in the PPI thing, and show you two different ways of editing. Firstly, if I was going to edit it in Lightroom and using effects, then what that would look like. And then I can go into Photoshop and quickly show you how I did it in Photoshop, and you'll see how I'd used the luminosity masks and the like. So that might be a good way to go about it. If that's okay with everyone, thumbs up if it is. Right, okay, so I won't go to all of the detail of let me open this. For the particular image that did quite well for me recently, it's photo stacked. It's focus stacked. So I took 3 shots effectively for different focusing. So one will be focused on the foreground, one will be in the middle, and one will be at the top. So ordinarily you could just focus stack those quite easily in Lightroom. I didn't, because I did it in Photoshop. But if you were to do that, all you would do is select the 3 images, right mouse click, photo merge, and do HDR. No, sorry, do panorama as a step. Oh, actually, no, you can't do, right, focus stacking you can't do in Lightroom, you have to do that in Photoshop. But I do a lot of HDR in terms of if I'm exposure stacking or panorama, and I do them straight from Lightroom. But for today's purposes, I'm just going to take the one that has got the sharpest foreground, which should be my first one, and it is. And effectively, if you do buy color effects or the effects group of things, all you have to go and do is edit in, and by the time you've bought them and followed the instructions to load them as add-ons, you'll get this list here. And the 2 that most people tend to use are color effects and silver effects. And the great thing about the effects modules are you can use them in either Lightroom or Photoshop, so you don't have to choose one. They'll work for both, which works well. So I'm going to take this into Color Effects Pro and use just the standard things. You get to choose whether you want to edit an original, a copy, or something with Lightroom adjustments. Actually, let me quickly move you guys so I can actually see what I'm doing. I probably haven't edited a great deal in here. I've made some basic changes. I've warmed it up a little bit and made
Vikki, is there a great difference between the free version that you can still get of the Nick collection and the new version?
I haven't bothered upgrading to the paid one.
Oh, so you're actually using the free one, okay.
Yeah, so well, I went through several instances. I had no, I probably did pay for one a couple of years ago, but I haven't paid since. So it's been sold again since. So DxO or whatever it is keeps trying to tell me I need to upgrade, and I haven't bothered because my view is this works as well as I need it to be. I have created a whole load of my own profiles or templates in there, and you can actually take those along and import them. But to be honest, that's what I want. So I haven't bothered paying for the latest version.
Yeah, so sounds good.
So I've made some basic adjustments in Lightroom, but nothing major. And then you go in and edit in Google Effects Pro. And I tend to just edit with Lightroom adjustments. The reason I might do differently is if I've created a TIFF and already worked on it, then I might want to go back into the same thing. But generally keeping it separate will mean that you might end up with several versions of it, but I'd rather have several and then delete one than overwrite one that I really liked. So when you come into Color Effects Pro, it will normally take you into the latest view that you had. So I'll very quickly go through some of the different ways it works. And effectively, for me, it will take me into my recipes. So I have a number of recipes that I tend to use. I've got some favorites, and this is what they look like. But before I tell you about recipes, I'll just talk about the actual different things that you can do. So there's a whole host of things you can do in here, and different people use different things. Each of these is a different effect you might layer over your image. In reality, most people I know use between 3 and 5. So once you've worked out which ones of these you want to use, and I'll show you if you were to take this, which ones I use, then you can just click on the star on the left-hand side and it marks it as your favorite. So instead of having all of this that I never use, and I've even set my mum up on this, for example. So, you know, she uses some things now, and I've just created her a basic template so she doesn't have to see all of the stuff that's there. So for me, the things I tend to use personally are light and dark and center. I use a lot. So if I were to select that, for example, let me just out of the way so I can get to my things. You can always at any time press this compare button and it shows you with and without all of the things that you've allowed for. For dark and light and center, you've got 2 different ways of doing it. If you look up on the right hand side here, you can either choose to do it as a kind of round oblong or a central one. And the way to see what it does is to actually, the things on the right hand side are the different scales and parameters you can change. So if, for example, you make it the maximum luminosity and the kind of lowest border, which is making it smaller, you can see the effect it's going to have. I don't tend to bother too often with this center size. It depends on what I'm doing. Normally I would leave it in the middle. And this place center thing is really important. So effectively, if you're saying I want to create a vignette, which is what this is, you'll normally want to select the thing that is of most interest or the area you want people's eye to go to. And in this one, it probably is going to be fairly central. But when you're playing about, just maximize the impact and it allows you to get it right. And then if you double click on any of these settings, it takes you back to whatever it believes the standard would be. The other very basic thing to mention is control points. I'll show you a little bit more in a minute, but you don't have to worry about that. I didn't touch them at all for donkeys, but you can change how much of it you want to see. So sometimes for my personal use, I might only go 50% of something rather than 100%. But basically just fiddle around with these and see what you like. So dark and light and center, a grad. So as you might expect, it does what it says on the tin. It creates a virtual graduated filter. You can move it up and down the center. You can rotate it just like you would do if you were putting a filter on the front of your camera lens. Polarization, again, that's pretty much what it says, but it's one of the only systems I've found that can try and recreate some polarization effect. Pro contrast, so I'll just talk a little bit about pro contrast and tonal contrast. And then what I'll do is come back and show you a recipe so you can see it a bit more generally, because I know I'm talking quite quickly. So when I first started, I used tonal contrast. This is the main reason that I still use Google Effects and the likes, is because the contrast is really, really good. I didn't tend to like the standard. For me, it was a bit too heavy-handed, so I tend to use fine. But you've got some choices here, so you can literally work out either high pass or fine are the 2 that I tended to use more often, but some people might like something, you know, a bit stronger. So for me, I would normally use fine or high pass. And again, this is the standard. So if you want to look at it before and after, so you can kind of see this detail really comes out quite nicely if you use that. More recently, I've used less of the tonal contrast and more of the pro contrast. And that allows you to do color correcting. I very rarely need to do it, but you do have this dynamic contrast. So this is one I've actually started liking a lot more because it's more subtle, and I think that tends to be my preference in the main. So quite often I just use dynamic contrast now. So use one or other, not both. Otherwise you're effectively doubling up on everything you do and it'll get really, really garish. The next two are probably the ones that I like the most, but they're definitely the ones that change the feel of the image most. So skylight filter and sunlight. What do they do? Well, you can kind of see what sunlight does straight away. It's pretty much like an Autumn effect or Gaussian blur, because all the things like NikEfex does is it takes things that are already in existence in Photoshop and give it names that people will feel more comfortable with and make it easier for them to use. So effectively with sunlight, it tends to warm it up a little bit and it makes it a bit more blurry. I always have a muted version of this. So this is a good example of where I'll either go to 10% if I want to use it, and or I'll reduce the opacity as well, because otherwise I feel it can be a bit heavy-handed. But I love the sunlight, and skylight filter does a kind of a similar thing. But with sunlight, you can warm it up. It desaturates it a little bit. You can play with the contrast, but more often than not, I keep to most of the settings. So those are the ones that I use most. But if you look at all of them, there are loads and loads of other ones. So one that I may occasionally use is, for a sky, for example, is detail extractor. So this is quite good for bringing out the sky detail, and do ignore all of the horrible dust spots I've got on here. This was my first trip out with my Sony camera, so mirrorless, and where I was using an adapter for my Canon lenses, it seemed to somehow have so many dust spots that it almost made me regret moving to mirrorless, but it's getting better now. So you can see with detail extractor, actually it allows you to see where all your dust spots are and allows you to see some of the stuff going on. So sometimes I use that in the sky. You can do some really, interesting, creative stuff with some of the things that go on here, like midnight. So it's good for playing as well if you want more artistic effects. For me, I tend to use a limited palette. So recipes. Let me see if I can show you the different ones. You'll get a set when you get it. So these 10, I think, are the ones that come through. So this will effectively apply a whole load of the individual components that we just looked at. So this bleach portrait, for example, I really enjoy. I don't use it much, but I kind of like the effect, right the way through to super detailed ones, which I really don't like, but others might. Vintage saturation. The ones
Vikki, when you apply the recipe, does that get applied to the base image?
Only to the fact that you are currently in another piece of software that's taken a copy of it. So the things that you're doing here now, it's applying within this module as a separate software. And when you save and close it, it will take that version of the file and create a TIFF with those changes, but it won't touch your original file in Lightroom as long as you didn't say edit original. So that's why I would always go in and do edit a copy.
Right, so it's the file that you bring from the processing program that you're actually applying the changes to.
Yes, you're doing it just inside this this Google Effects or NikEfex, whatever you want to call it, and it renders a TIFF that it then sends back to your originating software.
Okay, thanks.
So these are the ones that come for free, and the ones I tended to like was either Warm Sunset, or actually I think there's just a general landscape one, soft landscape, which are probably more kind of my style, but I've created a whole load over the years. So you'll see that I've created, and I normally end up naming it for the places that I've been so that I can go back and find it if I'm doing a whole load of places. Like Aldeafoss is one of my favorite ones. One of the first ones I created was from Iceland. And you'll see on the right hand side here, it's a build up of the different things that you want. And you can add more, you can add filters and put several more, and you can save the recipe and give it a name. So for me, the basic one, if I was someone starting out and I was a landscape photographer that likes the same kind of things that I like. So for my mother, for example, I've got a base version of the things I'm most likely to consider putting on there. So I've created one for my mum. I helped Janet do some for hers. I've set some other people up with theirs. So this is my base, and this is this light and dark center that we talked about. You'll see my personal one is a lot less strong than the default. So the default tends to be, if I go back to default, looks a bit like that. And actually the default probably looks better for this particular scene than my normal style of one. But let's actually use this image and do a quick edit to say how would I want to do it. So I would make it as pronounced as possible. I would pick, and in this instance, I think I'd probably, so you can just hover over these and it will show you the differences. For example, I suspect I'm going to prefer something slightly in the middle because that takes your eye through the image. And then you just double click it back to get to where you want to. Pro contrast, it's already applied. So for me, 36% is what I like. And for all of these, you can turn them on and off individually. So if I took them one by one, for example, that's my dynamic light and center when I add it on. Pro contrast in the standard I tend to apply is looking like that. Glamour glow is looking like that, and that feels like that might be a little heavy for what I want. But I'll leave it on for now. And skylight filter barely makes a difference actually. So I would probably take my glamour glow that's at 27% and probably bring it down a little. I might not want it to desaturate it too much either, so I might bring the color back more as it was originally. And that's most of what I would generally do in Google Effects. But in this instance, I did a reasonably long exposure, so it's losing a lot of the sky detail. So this is, for example, where I might say, right, I'm going to go in and put that detail extractor on. And this, as an example, is way too much for me. So that suddenly makes it look, if I turn it on and off, it suddenly looks really grainy and gritty, and it's not how I would want it to be. So if you want to do it in a gradual way, in Lightroom, that's where you start using these control points. In Photoshop, I'd probably create it as I want to and then just blend the bits that I want into my layer. But I'll show you as if you're just doing it for Lightroom here, because I know some people just use Lightroom. So the control points are quite simply, do I want to add the effect or do I want to remove the effect? So for this, I'm really interested in it for the sky. So I'd probably just go and put that on. And if this is making sense to them, I can make it bigger or smaller by dragging that button. And this allows me to say, well, how much of an effect do I want? And you can cut and you can just copy and paste these kind of things like you would do in most software. So Control C and Control V allows me to put another one on and another one on and another one on. So if I now turn that detail extractor on and off, you can see it's pretty much only happening to the sky. If I want to get even more detailed, because I do tend to get quite anal with details personally, you can start looking at where it's applying with things down here. So like I say, this is only if you want to start doing micro amounts, but this button here allows you to see where it's being applied, and the white reveals, black conceals. So it's applying it to the sky, it's also applying it partially to the mountain. So I might decide to add a minus onto the mountain to try and say, well, I don't want so much of it there. And then I can just see it again. So that in effect is how I would go about doing a Google Effects image. And that's my kind of general preference for how I do things. Before I come back into Lightroom, does anyone have any questions? Because it's more of a teaser, so you can see, is it something you'd like to try? And then it comes down to playing. But are there any questions?
Are the layers on the right-hand side stacked in order so you could move them about? You
could, but it doesn't actually make any difference because it doesn't apply it in a 1, 2, 3 format. They're all either applied or they're not. So that's where you just get it's almost like a Boolean, a kind of on or off scenario. So you could just turn each of them off individually to see what you want to do. So it doesn't really matter. It's not layers as it would be in other software. So I'm going to save that now and go back into Lightroom, and we can kind of see the before and after. Before I go into some Photoshop stuff. Well, actually, I'll quickly show you silver effects as well, because I love silver effects, but that's because I love black and white. And the concept you'll see is very similar, although it's a slightly more reduced palette of things that you can do. But if I was starting out as a landscape, this is the one thing I'd probably make the effort to buy if you can't get the free one anymore. Right, so it's created one and it's called Edit, so you can see that that's what it is. So effectively,
I've got the free one on my PC if anybody wants it.
Excellent. So there you go, that's the before. By the time it's finished rendering, that's the after. But you can also see now I'm going to need to go and sort out all those hideous spots as it's done. If I now look at my, go to my green ones. So these are my edited ones.
Oh, I'll be back in a minute. I just need to go and get a delivery at the door.
No problem. So this is the one that I edited in Photoshop. So you can see there's a little bit more detail going on there. I've pre-opened it in Photoshop because it's a big file, so it would take quite a while. Actually, no, I said I was going to show you SilverEfex. So let me do a quick, same kind of concept, edit in SilverEfex. And what I'm doing here, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference, but what I'm doing here is editing the TIFF that I've already done the changes, because quite often with black and white, you may well process it as a color before you take it into black and white. I do that quite often just because you get the tonality right. So again, I'm going to edit with Lightroom adjustments. Because gel stuff was great last night, but it really does make it look super, super complicated. And what he does is complicated. The guy is a genius at what he does. And the fact that he loves talking about it only taking him a week or 28 hours now, because it used to take 4 weeks before he developed his own software to do it all. So he doesn't realize that for most of us, we wouldn't want to go and do that anyway. Right, so same kind of thing with...
Vikki, could I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
You've got a lot more detail in the sky in this image than you had on the one that you showed us in ColorEfex.
Yes, so this is because I'm using my Photoshop version. So I didn't do this in ColorEfex, although I used it a little bit in Photoshop. So I'll show you that in a minute, for sure. But yeah, there's more sky in here. But funny enough, the sky here has come out from using the detail extractor and some luminosity masks.
Okay, so are we looking at the finished image here, or the?
You're looking at the finished image, but I've just thrown it into SilverEfex so I can show you how it works within there.
Right.
So SilverEfex is the same kind of concept in terms of you've got lots of different presets, and you've got a number of basic ones. You've got vintage. It categorizes them into some of the things that they might like you to do. The ones that I tend to use, and you can see I haven't bothered creating favorites in here, but I think I do have some custom ones. Let's look at my custom ones. Oh, look, you've got a gel tintular. So I created a really heavy black and white one so I can see whether an image feels like it might be something I would want to bother doing my extreme long exposure for. So I created one there, and a couple of others that I've created, but I don't tend to create too much because I always pick one and change them. So the difference in SilverEfex is you would normally go through and see which ones feel like it's a good starting point. The ones I tend to like, I have a favorite one called Wet Rocks and Fine Art Processing. So Wet Rocks is one that I particularly like, and Fine Art is a bit more gentle. But there's a whole host in here. So actually, if you like black and white, you're likely to find something that might either do what you want of it or get you a good amount of the way through. So you would just scroll through and find something that you like as a starting point. So I quite like the dynamic range one as well. And then once you've picked the starting point, actually they've pretty much all got the same things on the right hand side. So you just have to start playing with the things that you want there. The one thing I would say, so vignettes, for example, you can add, and there's different types. You can either have a fall off or a flat frame in terms of do you want the really dark corners. I've obviously already done my vignetting in this particular image, so it doesn't add as much as you might want. The one thing, if you start playing with SilverEfex, I suggest you also play with is the color filter, because it can make a huge difference. So for exactly the same filter we've got here, that's a neutral. if it wants to focus on the red tones, then you do this, and you can literally just go through and see how different some of them are, and some may be materially so if there's a lot of blue in the image, for example. And it's using the color channels if people care about color channels. I certainly don't use them to a huge degree, but it's worth just playing with these to see if it gives you a better starting point. So like I say, similar kind of concept to color effects. It's got less things that you can play with. You tend to use it just on the right hand side, and as a result I don't tend to bother saving too many of the recipes, but I do like fine art process for me, and my favorite of all of them tend to be the wet box. So that was just a quick taster. Let's go into Photoshop. Right, so this is my final image, and how many people don't use Photoshop? I can't see you because I've moved it out of the way so that I can actually see my screen. So you might have to unmute yourself and shout if you don't use Photoshop or don't use layers.
I have it, Vicky, but very seldom use it.
Okay.
Spot healing brushes are about all I use, I think.
Cool, David. So I was exactly the same for a long time, and then when you start spending time with people that do use it and they demystify it a little bit, then it kind of encourages you to go away and try it. And what you can see I've got here, the two things that are different here is this panel here and this panel here. So this is the TKActions that I've mentioned. So for a lot of people, using something like Lightroom and the NikEfex will be all they'll need, except for, you know, if they want to do some cloning. For those that want to get involved in more detailed stuff, or a techie, so I'm a tech, I'm an ex-developer, I like technology, and I like how it can work, then I have that kind of mindset that I want to learn. And this looks really, really daunting, and I would never have started using it. I kind of dabbled in it, but until I started sitting down with other people that used it and they could show me the basic things and that they would use it for, did I start understanding the power and find it less daunting. So I now use it a lot, and I'll show you some of the things. Rather than try and create it from scratch, I'll show you some of the things that I did. In Photoshop, the thing I do like is the ability to be able to name and group certain things so you can see what you're doing. So if I kind of turn some of these off and start with land, so it kind of looks like there's quite a lot going on here. And the first thing I had to do was my focus stack. So if I turn some of these off, right, so I started with my focus stack. I then removed some of the dust spots and distractions. So you'll see over here, just turn that something up for now. Okay, you'll see over here that I just wanted to clean it up a little bit. You can call different names of things here. So here I did a dodge at the right hand side, so you can't see it too much, but I did a tiny amount of dodging, and I'll show you in a minute what these are. So these are the luminosity masks I'm doing. And then here I reduced the brightness of the snow that was capturing the light there. So before I go to all of them, why don't I quickly show you.
Can I ask a silly question, Vicky?
Yeah.
I take it what you're pointing to just now, are they all separate layers? Not using it, as I say, it might sound silly, but are they all separate layers that you've created for the sky, the land?
They are, yeah. So
right.
effectively,
right.
If I were to, let me save this as a, I'm going to very quickly do a save as. It might take a longer than I'm going to. Doing that. Actually, I'm going to do it with a zip so it's quicker. Because what I'm going to very quickly do, so that I can come back.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Because I've realised I probably need to show and maybe the easiest way to do it is do it on an unedited one. So let me pick an unedited one. So this, for example, is one of my favourite ones of all of them, so much so that I haven't actually started editing it because it's almost, I don't want to get it wrong, so I've been editing lots of other ones first. So that's working. So let me just show you on something that I've done nothing with, what things like luminosity masks does. So for me, effectively, what luminosity mask allows you to do primarily is to say, what would I normally do in Photoshop? And then how do I do it selectively? So for example, one of the first things I might do in an image is look at the curves and give it a little bit of an S-curve. I mean, if you press auto, it will tell you what it actually thinks should happen, and you can always take that as a starting point. But I'm going to do something just for kind of extreme effect to show you how it works, because I would never edit something like that. So effectively, I'm going to say I actually really like hypothesis. I really like the depth of contrast by making the darks really dark and the lights really light. But I would never want to do that up here because it looks hideous, and I wouldn't necessarily want to do it on here. So I'd come up to my luminosity masks, and what this is telling us is these are kind of dark masks and these are light masks. And I get that a lot of people might find this challenging until you start doing it. So you've got ways of saying light masks, dark masks, midtones. Some people actually just like using a 0 to 1, but you'll find that 90% of what you do is going to be targeted to either light things. And if you press it, what this does is it shows you what mask it's likely to create. So for the lights, that's the brightest lights it's going to do, or the light, you know, the least bright ones, right the way down to, if I just wanted the most bright thing in the whole image, what would that look like? So you would go along and say, well, if I'm wanting to do my light stuff, I'm really interested in doing it in the foreground. And actually, this might be the right level of detail because it's not picking up every single thing you've got. And once you've worked out that that's what you want to do, and when Joel was mentioning it last night, I don't know if people kind of understood that white reveals, black conceals. So it's just a mnemonic to be able to get in your head the fact that if it's white, it means it's going to apply it. If it's black, it means it's not. So effectively here, I could say, yes, I'm happy with that, and I'm going to apply it to that layer. So now the layer is only really heavily working on the areas that you selected. In a similar way that if I did the darks to say, well, actually, I'm only interested in the dark stuff now, I'll start with, you know, the most dark and work my way up. So it depends on what you are going to apply anyway, in terms of which luminosity mask you would want to create. And TKActions just makes all of those easy for you. And it can do lots of other things as well, but that would just overcomplicate. So you could use some of these to create the layers that you want, but actually if you know what layer you want to create, then you would simply apply it that way around. So what I've done now is it's now applying it to the dark instead of the light, which I probably prefer a little bit. So that's what luminosity masks in and of themselves do. What TKActions also does is a whole host of things. So for example, my favorite things in TKActions, after I've done a few of these, tend to be in this panel here. And I know it's complicated, but just bear with me. So I like this for the vignettes and spotlights. So now that I use less of the effects that we talked about, the color effects and what have you, it's because I've got more control doing it over in here. So for example, I tend to do a lot of spotlights and vignette, and the two of those are the equivalent of light and center, dark and outside. But what's great about this is you can either say, I'm just going to do a standard vignette, and you can mess around with this, but most of the time you don't need to. This is going to show you what vignette it's going to do and apply it. So if you don't want to do anything but take a standard, you can, and that's the kind of vignette it's going to give you. But what I love about this is I can do a freehand vignette. And by doing that, effectively, grab my pen. If I get my lasso tool, I can say, well, I want my vignette to be this shape, because that's where I want my dark stuff. And of course, you can't do this in Lightroom, you can't do this in color effects, but you can do it really, really easily in this kind of software. And then that's done my vignette, so I can turn it on, turn it off to see what it looks like. But I might also want to have a light and center, and exactly the same is true. You can either apply a normal spotlight, or you can draw one or more spotlights. So if I go in here, I'm going to say I want a spotlight and apply it. And I might want a spotlight here. And you're just in so much more control that I'm finding it makes a big difference in the images that I'm putting together. What else do I tend to use in there? They tend to be the main ones I use. Then the other things, and some people use the alt and effects in here. I find that a little heavy-handed, so I tend to use color effects still to do that kind of stuff. But effectively, they're the kind of things I tend to use it for. The other thing is this web sharpen down here. So for anyone that doesn't sharpen their images for web, that's fine. I didn't either for a long time. I tend to do it a little bit more now, but partly because this has made it so easy for me. So effectively, if you're a data geek like me, you'll research and find out what kind of dimensions work best for Instagram or for Facebook, for example. So I happen to know for Instagram, 1600 is the maximum that you want for vertical. So if you click the button and you've set that to however big you want it, or for FCC, you just put it as 1200, 1600. So you can create exactly what you want for images to send out for the full cut competitions, and this will do the sharpening for you. And then once you've checked you're happy with it, by and large, I might go for less, so the opacity. Then when you go to save on there, it allows you to name it and go and put it somewhere. So effectively, you can quarantine it away, and I can quickly and easily do my my competition submissions and know they're the right size. Yeah, so sRGB obviously because that's competition. So it's things like that even that makes life so much easier. And then you've also got things like, let me close out, that creates a new, an actual new image for that, so you just dispose of it afterwards. The other thing I like is you've got silly things like this here. So that's just going to turn on and off the masks that you've created in less clicks than it would take to do it normally. You can, this button here does things like it'll delete all of the non-visible ones here. This will do dodge and burn for you and set them to standard things. So once you start using
I take it, Vikki, the TK7 application is effectively like helper tools that actually sort of hide a lot of the complexity away.
Absolutely, it does. And the chap that created it works with some photographers that I got to know and get on really well with. So effectively, you know, Photoshop even worked with him to try and work out what people really want and how they work together really well. And they've managed to give him loads of data around what are the most common things people do, so he can automate it for them. So I myself don't use too many of the things in here. You get your favorites, you end up using a handful of tools most of the time. So in here I probably use this stuff here. I used a couple I mentioned. This helps people that don't know Photoshop yet to start using it more quickly and easily. And some of the online tutorials they do are phenomenal. I've got habits now, so there's certain things I just go and do myself. So if I'm going to dodge and burn, I do go and use the normal, you know, dodge and burn things. Whereas if you don't know Photoshop all that well, these things just do it for you. So yeah, there's certain things when you're merging that you press a button here and it does the equivalent of 10 steps you would normally need to do in Photoshop. So you just kind of find, and I think this is about, I don't know, 30 quid, 40 quid. You know, it's not an expensive thing to buy as the TKActions, but the amount of time it saves you to do that, I find brilliant. So let me quickly take you back through. So, but you can see just from a few things that I've done here, and if I take that and just put it, because that's the equivalent, I like light and dark, and I've got control over that kind of stuff really, really quickly. So Photoshop's kicked off a new thing. So yeah, if I'm going to show you how I did this really briefly, focus stack, remove the dust spots using these luminosity masks. You can see I literally just blacked out everything, but a little bit I wanted to dodge on that right hand side. The same for the brightness on here. And this is all done with, effectively, I've done the equivalent of a luminosity mask up here. And then sometimes just said, I'm just going to take it heavy handed and put a brush on it. And sometimes I've used the detail. Here you'll see that I did the detail extractor. So I've gone in to color effects, and I tend to name it after what I did in there so I can tell. So you can see here I've done my base and a 50% detail extractor. That's exactly the recipes that I applied that I still use in there. Here, what's it say? Detail extractor.
Vikki,
for
can
the
I just
mountain.
ask?
Yeah.
Are you doing some of this in Photoshop, then exporting to your color effects, and then going back to Photoshop again?
Yeah, you can do so, but in here it's a case of, so if I take a quick, so every now and again you'll see something that says stamp. So the one thing that you have to do for color effects is it needs to have an actual file it's going to work on. So it can't handle these kind of things that's been done with layers and luminosity masks. So what you have to do is create a stamp. So if I were to switch all of these back on, and obviously it's going to look really, really horrible if I do it from here. Actually, I stopped doing that. So I'm going to create a stamp, which is just a basic layer. Just thinking about it. Actually, I don't take this one. It's a stamp already. And here, if you go to filter, you go to NikEfex. So you've got exactly the same concept going on as we did in Lightroom. And if I then go into Color Effects Pro, I'll show you what will happen. It may take a little while because it's a big file. And again, it gets to the stage where it remembers what you do. So quite often it will take your, so look, surprise, surprise, light and dark and center. But if I were to have chosen, I don't know, midnight, for example, and I say, yes, that's what I want. It brings it back in and creates a layer for you. And it puts it exactly where you were. It thinks about it. And then if it's just a recipe, it will name it after the recipe. And then you can do all the normal things that you might want to do, like say, well, actually, that's way too much. I want to make it smaller or less small. Does that make sense? So hence for land, the last thing I think I had there, so you'll see the detail extractor, was just some hue and saturation for up in this area here. And like I say, I kind of really like the detail play. It's something I find quite therapeutic, so I probably spend more time than a lot of people might want to. But if I were to then say, what did I do here? So you'll see that I added a glamour glow. So again, detail extract sky and glamour glow. So this is where some of the sky that you noticed, Joan, is coming back in a bit. And again, I've done it at 50%. So what it obviously brought back in from Google Effects was more than I wanted it to. So I decided I obviously only wanted half of that. Then I've just done, you've got kind of a hard mask that Joel talked about, but I blurred it a little bit because I found that was just a bit too much. So I've added some more brightness, some more hue and saturation to the sky. So effectively, that's got the sky. The reason that brings more in than the sky should do is because I created that stamp that brought in some of the other stuff. Here I've created another stamp for more dust spots, and that's obviously brought through some other bits and pieces. I made a change a bit later on. So, but effectively you can just see the masking down the side and the luminosities and vignettes just get applied to whatever you normally do. But a lot of them that have any detail in them, especially if you're looking at that, has been done or started to be done with a luminosity mask, because it just makes it so much easier Yeah, that's a great example of how I just wanted to apply that Google Effects detail to the mountain area, in particular the darkest area. So I wanted to bring out the detail in the dark side of things, but not everything else. So does that make sense as a taster for those that might already know a bit about Photoshop and how it works, to see how these kind of things will start to make it more precise in how you apply things?
Yeah.
But for the newer people in Lightroom, and the NikEfex stuff is absolutely brilliant, because interestingly enough, if I close this down, yes, we'll be able to see my edited stuff. Yes, we'll be able to see, oh, that's the NikEfex one. If you cancel out of a Google Effects thing, it actually still creates it, which is a little bit annoying. So I'll delete that. But effectively, if we now look at that versus this one, which was the one we did in Color Effects. Is that the right one? So I'd obviously had to straighten the horizon a little bit. There's quite a big difference in the amount of time and effort I've gone into in my final one. But actually, if you just look at the basic one without any editing, in and of itself, it could start making a difference. And the majority of stuff I used to do was just using that. Any questions?
What would you say is the best one to start using as a beginner?
A beginner, the NikEfex, absolutely.
With Lightroom.
Lightroom, and a lot of people use Bridge, but that's before Lightroom came along. People used Bridge to get into Photoshop. The majority of people I know now still, use Lightroom, and it just gives you confidence. You can so quickly and easily do things in Lightroom, because Lightroom was created as a simplified version of Photoshop. I mean, that's its entire reason, is to allow you to library and catalog what you do and make it easier to access in this develop panel, the kind of things that you would do elsewhere. So yeah, I would definitely encourage that.
I use Photoshop Elements along with NikEfex.
Right.
Works fine.
Yeah.
I haven't used it very much for the color effects. It's more the black and white stuff.
Yeah, I have to admit, for me, it was Silver Effects that I bought the whole package for originally, because I love my mono. But yeah, Elements is again, it was a precursor to Lightroom. So Lightroom ended up being something they would sell standalone, without needing any Photoshop. But now that most people go for Creative Cloud, they get both anyway. So so you find yourself being drawn into the dark side of Photoshop over time.
I think it all depends. Certainly Elements over the years has come closer and closer to Photoshop. And there are add-ons to Elements that you can get from third parties.
Yeah.
That give you things like luminosity masks and all the rest. And I think it just boils down to whether you want to be part of a monthly subscription routine, or whether you just want a one-off cost and off you go.
Yeah, I mean, I started off with Lightroom. I got the one-off cost. I think it was 100 odd quid at the time, and that was fine. I only got it, funnily enough, because I had a really bad dust spot on my lens and I didn't notice, and I went on holiday and took a whole holiday's worth of pictures that had a huge blob on it. So I taught myself Lightroom through their own online tutorials, and then that's what allowed me to start doing my own processing. But yeah, I just find they're dead easy. Then I needed to upgrade. So I decided that I'd go for the Creative Cloud then. And I kind of like that concept now, because you can have the most up-to-date version, and what is it, 10, 15 quid a month for the Creative Cloud? So for me, that's fine, because this is my hobby. I get a lot more pleasure out of it than I could spend 15 quid elsewhere. So any other questions? Because that's we've already taken up 50 odd minutes. So is everyone still with us?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's just highlighted that, there's so much to learn.
Even Stuart Squirrel.
It's pretty daunting.
But I've shown the two extremes here, I guess. If you start using something like Silver Effects and Color Effects, actually it isn't too daunting, because it's literally just click and press and see what it does. So that's why I wanted to show both sides, which is for those that are new to it, I would definitely say Lightroom or Elements, but Lightroom is the more common practice choice nowadays. And then something like the Google Effects is just a brilliant way to be able to do more advanced stuff. If you're already into Photoshop and like layers and want to get more advanced in how you apply them, then it's worthwhile looking at something like TKActions, because it just makes that step so much easier. So it's an either or, I think, to start with, because the likelihood is you'll probably, if you're fairly new to it, go down the Google Effects route, and then you can just carry on using that in Photoshop. If you never use the Google Effects, then you'll find out how to do exactly the same thing through either Photoshop or TKActions. It's just that I use the one that I know most and intertwine the two together.
The NikEfex, the free one, you can't get on the web these days, but there are enough copies rolling about the camera club that we can supply anybody that wants one with it.
Yeah, I can put a copy on my server, and I'll provide a link to it if anybody wants it for the PC anyway.
Yeah, I think people it's easy to get addicted to, and May, I know you said you probably wouldn't use any of these kind of things, but I don't think you'd have any problem with NikEfex once you started having a play.
I'll have Stuart's, thanks very much. I think you offered it before, and I maybe just thought, keep that away from me.
No, it's good just to have a play with, because it is just basically one click, and you can see all the effects. So,
And as Joan says, I guess there's enough of us that use it in the club now as well, that if you did choose to apply it, yeah, exactly. So, what I did with my mum, and you've met my mum enough times, she's not overly techie. I just sat with her for 15 minutes and we worked out what she liked in it, and we just created her a base setup. So for her, she'll go in and press that base setup, and it's there for her, because that's, she can tweak a little bit, but she doesn't have to do too much. So, I think any of us that use it in the club would be happy to do something similar with newer members to the club that want to get going with it. So, just take that initial learning curve out of it and help you create one, and then play from there.
And there's plenty of the presets there already. I mean, it could be that you're quite happy with what's given you, so you need to go no further.
I was certainly found I was so much happier with pictures just with a little bit of playing with that than I was beforehand. So it gave me a huge amount of confidence to just play a bit more.
Not having heard of any of these things before, is it just a case of you click on a link and it installs it automatically into your software?
Yes and no. So it normally comes with a set of instruction guides. So I think effectively
Stuart will be supplying those, so.
Yeah, well, effectively, by the time you've created the package, so I'm a Mac user, for example, it'll be slightly different for Windows. By the time you've created it, you normally need to go into either Lightroom or Photoshop, and then there's a way of being able to, you've got these plugin managers. So effectively, you can then go in and add them. So for example, I don't use the HDR Effects Pro, I think that was part of it. Helicon Focus is a focus stacking. LRT is a time-lapse plugin that I have. So this is probably where the NikEfex stuff is. So all you have to do is go in and choose where it goes. And that's it, really. And there's a similar kind of step you need to go through on Photoshop, but it's just a one process.
So is it NikEfex or Google Effects? I've heard you saying both.
Yeah, and actually now I think it's called DxO Effects, but we have
Stuart, what are you doing?
I think most of them will end up taking you to wherever they are now. Nick Collection. Here you go. So if you type Nick, so I just put NikEfex, and Nick Collection is where it now is. So effectively, you could come in here and look to buy them if you wanted to.
When it was made free, it was Google that owned it, and then obviously they sold it on. So the Nick Collection that I've got the installer executable for is obviously the Google
one.
version.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, I was about
6 or something, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, I was about to buy the Nick one just for Silver Effects when Google bought it. So that was a bit of a boon for me to get it for free. And having got it for free originally, I don't really want to spend too much more money on it. But yeah, if you get the
Yeah, I mean, if anybody wants further information regarding installing it, I can certainly uninstall it on my laptop and go through a full install and record the screen, so it's not a problem.
Great. Yeah.
Is that
When
your
did the
shoes we can see there,
party-
Stuart?
Oh, there's Elaine. Have you just
Pardon?
missed it?
I don't know what happened there.
Elaine was there. It just depends on how many people you could see. Excellent. Well, if there's no more questions for me, there's 2 different routes for those of you with different levels, and give me a shout if you want any help.